Hello and welcome back to Remotely Speaking Up. This is the final episode of season 1 of our podcast and video series, and we're very happy that you joined us for the entire season. We're finishing off with a panel of our experts in our final block where we concentrated on enabling individuals to work better remotely. So we're just bringing together a lot of the issues that we discussed in previous episodes in this block, just to have a general discussion around them. And as you know, with our expert panel, we always bring in an additional expert. So I'll remind you who is on our panel now. We have Ron Johnson, who was with us last week. And Ron spoke to us about developing our personal brand online in particular, and how we can go about doing that. And we have Janice Sutherland, the very spirited Janice. You remember her episode? And Janice spoke to us about handling discrimination when working online. And we have as our additional expert, I would love to say award-winning Nichole McGill-Higgins. Just her recent accomplishment. Nichole recently won the Baton Awards for a Campaigner of the Year. And Nichole is very involved in the campaign space around discrimination issues and bringing matters of discrimination in the organization to light. So Nichole is here to help us unpick some of that in our conversation as we talk more about enabling persons to work better remotely. So I'm going to kick it off with you first, Ron. I'm going to kick it back to you in terms of talking about our brand and developing our brand online, because we have quite a mix of issues. On one hand, we said it's really important to find your niche online and so forth. But then we know also, because of some other issues we're going to discuss, there can be some challenges to that as well. So what do you see as the key challenges when it comes to developing your personal brand online?
Sure. So, before we get into the actual challenges, I just want to acknowledge that internet access is different around the world. So in terms of even getting online, sometimes it's difficult for entrepreneurs to kind of access some of the things that we take for granted. So a lot of times we're saying, well, how do we build our brands online? And some entrepreneurs across the world are, well, how do I get online in the first place? And sometimes the way they do get online is not with the level of access in terms of availability or in terms of speed. But I know that's kind of not the purpose of this discussion. I just want to kind of raise that as, just to remind us that internet access varies greatly across the world. But to get to your question in terms of, how do we build a brand online? I think we covered some of this in our session, Rochelle. But if I were to summarize, I would think that in terms of building a brand online, one of the biggest things you need to take notice of is the issue of distinction. There are so many people out there, online now, and they're trying to build their brands. They're reading the same articles online. They're following advice from people on podcasts and everything, and they're all trying to build their brands. So for me, one of the biggest challenges I think that entrepreneurs face, and it's a challenge and an opportunity, is this distinction. How do you online to stand out? In our session, we talked about one of my favorite books by Dory Clark called Stand Out. And a lot of times we just get online and we figure, well, this is going to be a breeze. So I have to do is put up some webinars, put some podcasts, and I'm good to go. Not so. For me, it's distinction. You probably recognize this. I brought this to our last podcast session. Yes, when I'm going out, I might go for coffee and people say, well, where's Star Salmon? They're missing it. Or on social media, if I take a picture without Star Salmon, people ask me, well, where's Star Salmon? So that has helped me a lot with distinction. But I don't want to make it seem like it's gimmicky. So a couple of quick examples. Rochelle, you do a fantastic job with your HR framework, which was really developed to help you to stand out from all the other HR professionals out there. That's distinction. I developed a framework that integrates the principles of both brand and HR. And that framework is called, wait for it, branding. But we spell it BHRANDING. It's basically integrating HR and branding. that helps with distinction. So if you can find something that's uniquely yours, whether it's a personality trait, whether it's a framework that no one's talking about right now, whether it's something that helps you stand up on stage or online, that's one of the first ways that you can help to build your brand online.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And I know there's a lot of push recently. And I know, Janice, you felt very strong about this as well with regards to that word being authentic online. Because when we talk about distinction, and now also this push to be distinct in online is this call for being your authentic self. I know, Jan, you had some issues with that as well. So what's your take on
I really agree with Ron. For me, it's not having a prop. For me, it's about who I am. And you describe me as being lively. So pretty much I'm like this all the time. Thank goodness it's natural. But it is about having that people being able to connect with you. And because I've been podcasting probably for over 3 years now, I've been able to get my guests very comfortable very quickly to literally spill their guts sometimes on things they didn't think they were going to talk about, but because your authenticity, they trust me. So it's almost building that virtual trust, which I think is also definitely a skill. So yeah, I'm very big on authenticity, because I think it's a lot much harder trying to recreate something you're not, when it's far easier being who you are, because you don't have to keep switching. Literally, you're not in code switching. It's personality switching just to be online. It's a lot easier.
Yeah, and that makes it a lot more difficult as well. And I know,
to replicate too.
Yeah, and to keep up.
Yeah.
And you're a good example of someone who stands out with your This Woman Can framework, as you said, your personality and so forth. I know, Nichole, as well, you've been standing out a lot recently as well. So what can you say in terms of what you do as well? Because you work quite a bit in championing the cause of persons that have been discriminated against. And you definitely have stood out for the work that you've done.
Yeah, and I think what Janice has said is absolutely correct. And also what Ron has said, but it's about being your authentic self. Yeah. I'm from a sales background, and one of the first things you learn in sales is people buy people. It's as simple as that. And you can't buy fakeness. You can't, and people see through that. And especially with this new era of being online, this virtual, this kind of virtual platform, you get to kind of see the fakes from the not. And also in sales, they say fake it before you make it. But I think we've moved away from the faking before you make it to like, you either like me or you don't, but this is what I have to offer. This is how I bring impact, and this is what I can do. And not everybody is going to like that, but you can learn from everyone. But if you're being yourself, then people will buy into that, because you're your product at the end of the day. Regardless of what else you're selling, what you're offering, you are the main part of that product who's delivering it. So for me, it is about being authentic, and it's about showing up, speaking up, and elevating others. I think that's just my strap line at the minute. You know, it's to show up and be yourself and be comfortable in who you are as well. And it's so funny. I mean, we've probably all done this when we was at school or at uni, or even in team meetings. You want to ask a question or you want to give an idea, and you think, such a stupid idea, I'm not going to say that. And then someone says it.
Yes.
And you think, I knew I should have said that first. So just say, because, you know, for years I wouldn't say I didn't understand something. And normally I'm the most confused person in the room. Let me tell you, I think if people were to put £1 for every time I say that I'm so confused, unpack that again for me. And I've learned to just say that, because why should I walk away not understanding? And have that dialogue, have that interaction with people. And also I think telling stories, having your lived experience when you're speaking to people, and take them along that journey. And then that's where the trust comes in, back to what Janet was saying. It's about building that trust quite quickly. And then that's where the magic happens for me. And then everybody starts talking. And I love hearing what my audience is thinking. I want to hear your experiences too. It's not just about me standing there or sitting there and telling you what should be done. I want to know, so how have you done that? Or how does that sit with you? Has that upset you? Has that triggered you? What ideas do you have around that? It's about that awakening. And when you bring your authentic self to that, you're able to help others to do that too.
Yeah, it really reminds me of storytelling. I'm very much a fan of storytelling. There's something really powerful about that, especially being able to connect to somebody else's experience. So when you actually be yourself and let people into your experiences, the fact that you don't understand, maybe you don't understand for a certain reason, the fact that their opinion of this is not the opinion that you share because your experience has been different. I find that's easier than telling somebody about your product, telling somebody about what you're selling.
Yeah.
Rather, the vision behind it, I think, can be more powerful.
Exactly.
That. Yeah.
I mean, I watched something today. Sorry, just quickly on LinkedIn. It was a TED talk by that lady, Stacey Adams. I think I've said her name wrong. Basically, the lady who just got Georgia to vote.
Abrams.
Yeah.
Abrams, right?
Abrams.
And she's just done a TED talk. It must be quite recent, and it's called "The 3 Things You Should Always Ask Yourself in Anything You Do." It's literally about 12 minutes and 13 seconds, and no word of a lie. It's the first TED talk I had to keep pausing and writing notes. It's phenomenal, and TED talks are about storytelling anyway. They kind of encourage you to do that. But she talks about. I mean, I'd literally encourage anyone who listens to this podcast and everybody here to just watch that. It's called Stacey Abrams.
Yeah.
Abrams. And it's literally three questions to ask yourself when doing anything. And the 3 questions are very simple, but she does that storytelling and you're literally sucked in. When it finishes, you're like, God, was that 12 minutes already? I mean, it took me about 40 minutes because I was taking so much notes. But just going back to storytelling, and you could tell that there was an element of nervousness around her being on the stage. But she's just been catapulted into to kind of that status now, hasn't she?
Yeah.
But again, it was just telling her story and why she did what she did and how she did it. And it's just phenomenal, going back to what you were just saying. So.
Yeah. I love that about these podcast episodes, the fact that one, I learned so much from you guys, but you also give me loads of homework. So I usually go in the background and Googling all of these books and so forth. It's brilliant. So I like what a lot of what you're saying, and I agree with a lot of it, that push, especially when people say show up as yourself, you know. And we're all familiar, I think we're quite familiar now with Dr. Terry Carella-Reed. And I love the posts that she usually has on LinkedIn and YouTube. And one of the things that she always says is show up for yourself. And often when I'm getting ready to come online and so forth, sometimes that mantra is in my head now. Because at the beginning of lockdown, I think I was very much just like, t-shirt, pajamas, it's online, it doesn't matter. But now that mantra constantly plays in my head to show up for yourself. And it's really important. So what happens though when you are showing up as yourself and you are not accepted in that space that you're in? Because one of the issues that I have found, as I said in my research in previous episodes, particularly in your episode, Janice, we spoke about when you are online, you're being yourself, you're being your own authentic self, or sometimes you have to dial that back because you're not being fully accepted. And what I found in my research is the issue that constantly kept occurring was persons working online were saying that they were experiencing discrimination. And I found that very surprising. I wasn't looking for it in my research. I just wanted to know about the work experience online. But constantly it came up when I spoke to Caribbean persons, when I spoke to persons in Thailand, in Indonesia, always the topic came up. So how do you, I'll ask you first, Janice, because you deal a lot in terms of standing up for yourself. You've also spoken about your experiences. What would you say in terms of encouraging organizations to, I don't know, engage persons at the same level or at an enhanced level and reduce that level of discrimination?
Well, the first thing I would say, because a lot of companies are now moving into that online space with virtual working and stuff like that, your leadership team, do not assume that your leadership team know how to lead a team that's virtual. The skill set is entirely different. The communication styles are different. The access to some of the information you'd have, such as body language, that's all different. That's all different. So from a leadership perspective, the leader has to be far more intuitive, has to coach, has to ask far more questions than they ever would do before, but more importantly, listen to what's actually being said and what's not being said, because that's where the gold really lies. You know, your team will tell you everything you want to hear, because you can't see what's going on behind the back of them. You know, because they're being virtual, they have this little facade, or they even have their visual background. But what you need to do is actually listen to what's not being said and be unafraid to ask those questions. You may be unpopular as a leader, but you're not here to be liked. You're here to lead, and you have to make that differentiation, that demarcation, and remember that. So I think from a lead, I think it starts with leadership, because if your team aren't happy, that tells me there's a challenge with the leadership.
Yeah.
And the team's not being led, and you know, and you're not having that interaction, you're not being open, you're not allowing enough forums for them to communicate. Doesn't always have to be in this setting, you know. How can you do offline? What does it look like? So you have to sit down and think a lot deeper about how you're going to lead this team going forward, to avoid some of those issues around discrimination and feeling isolated and left out and marginalized.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with a lot of that, because it should have that trickle down effect in terms of the culture that's created in the organization. I'm going to kind of open that up also to Nichole and Ron to jump in there as well, as in terms of your experience of that. Also, what do you think in terms of those issues and leadership in the organizations?
You go, Ron.
I think that right now there's a huge transition happening right now going on, and some people are more prepared for that transition than others. And what at one point in time was a nice to have is now a must have for certain types of businesses. I mean, there's some businesses that by their very nature cannot transfer online, that have to be done in person, manufacturing for instance. But there are others that have had no choice but to transition. And some of the leaders that may have been dead set against it, no, why would I allow you to work from home for 3 days out of the week or 5 days out of the work week, are now having to deal with that. I think that the organizations that accept that this is the new norm, you know, I'm giving that backdrop in terms of signaling that this is not nice to have, this is what the reality is. I think that the leaders who are going to do a better job in this new norm are the ones that are going to adapt more quickly. So biologists are quick to say, from a natural selection perspective, it's not the biggest of the species that survive, it's not necessarily the fastest. It is the ones who adapt most quickly to change. So in my business, we've had to adapt very, very quickly. And we're still adapting very, very quickly as well. There's a business fable I always like to tell when I'm doing workshops, doesn't matter where I'm doing them. And it's about these two hikers who were walking through the woods. And all of a sudden they encounter this huge bear, you know, just ready to devour them. And the first hiker, he bends down, he starts tightening his shoelaces because he's getting ready to make a run for it. He wants to make sure that his shoes are on tight. And the second hiker looks at him and says, "Oh, what the hell are you doing? You can't possibly outrun a bear." And the first hiker, he takes off, he looks over his shoulder and he says, "I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun you." You know, and the moral of this fable is that, I can see Janice kind of cracking up in the corner. The moral of this fable is that sometimes you don't have to take on the entire bear, right? You just have to outrun the guy in front of you, and natural selection is going to take place. So that bear could be an economic crisis. That bear could be a health crisis like the one that we're going through. It could also be revolutions in technology. You know, it doesn't matter. The bear can take many, many forms. It's really about how do we adapt as fast as we possibly can, and not just doing it randomly. The guy that tightened his shoelaces, he made a conscious decision to stop, take pause, you know, tighten his shoelaces and go. So what I would say is that when it comes to some of these issues that were being dealt with before, and many, many others, it's just about figuring out, okay, you know, I can't stay here and allow myself to be eaten by this bear. How do we tighten my shoelaces? How do I figure out how to manage team members remotely? When a month ago I told them, no, you can't stay home and work. But now it's like, please stay home and work, you know, and work with us. The other thing I would say is you're gonna have to get accustomed to failure of some sort. you know, in our session last week, Rochelle, I talked about one of my favorite entrepreneurs, which would be Sarah Blakely, the founder of Spanx. You know, when she came home from school, her dad would ask, well, what do you fail at today? And when she said, well, I fail at cheerleader, I fail at whatever, she'd get a high five. But if a week passed and she hadn't failed at anything, her dad would be disappointed because he knew if she wasn't failing at something, she probably wasn't trying hard enough at bigger projects. So the other thing I would say, aside from tying her shoelaces, is you have to get accustomed to failure. You are going to screw up at some point in time. Some policy that you put in place that was meant to have engagement remotely may not work. You know, some of the things that you did in person, which are perfectly fine, simply may not translate to a remote working environment. You know, you may try software that doesn't work. It may have worked for the other guy down there, but it's not working for you. You know, there's a bunch of things. If you get stuck in analysis paralysis, it's not going to do anyone too good. Try something, tighten your shoelaces, see if it works. If it doesn't, get up and go again.
Yeah,
I call that strategic fluidity. That's what I've said to you. You have to be strategically fluid, because whatever you thought about last week may not work tomorrow, may not work this week. And also adopting that MacGyver mindset. It may not all, and I'm a big one for that, because it may not always look pretty, but does it get the job done? What's your end goal?
Yeah, I agree. I was in a webinar episode a while ago. I was on a panel where someone gave the example of planning for the future. And they said, if you look at the Chinese had a good practice of planning 100 years for 100 years ahead. And my response on the panel was, that's no longer our environment. We can hardly plan for 5 months ahead because of this constant need for change. So I agree in terms of that strategic fluidity, and the need for leaders to adapt quickly. And I think, Ron, you made a really important point, especially in terms of going over the policies that existed and see if they still serve everyone within the organization, especially within the new organization setting. Whereas, let's say remote working or remote workers, online workers were seen as more casual, they are now the breadline of a lot of organizations. So actually making sure your policies are fitted and suited to everyone in your organization are particularly important. And I'm going to throw that over to you now, Nichole, because this is an area that's gotten a lot of increased attention. So what do you think organizations should be doing, and managers should be doing to make sure all workers feel protected and included in the organization?
And it goes back to what Ron and Janice has just said. And for me, it is really good to look at the technology, because I think, you know, COVID just really just shook everyone. And like you say, you had some people working from home or people who had never worked from home before. I feel at the beginning stages, organizations were very much about what technology we're going to have. Is this going to work? Is that not going to work? But the people were forgotten.
Yes.
And I think it's really important to speak to your people, because me, for example, I'm quite happy to work from home for the next 50,000 years. I'm very comfortable working from home. I'm in my zone. But when you're a leader or a manager, you don't know your employees' setup. You don't know if they're in shared accommodation. You don't know that, you know, if they're even in abusive relationships, or even if their properties aren't big enough, even if they have a desk at home. You don't know that. You know, digital poverty is huge. Yes, you can give them the technology, but what about their well-being? And for me, what leaders need to really be doing is having those conversations and creating those safe spaces and that trust, so they can be able to do that. And then I found working from home, and lots of organizations that I've worked with, is that we had just this constant technology. You had Teams buzzing, you had to get into meetings, where before you could walk past a coffee shop, bump into somebody, hi, how are you? You know, run late to a meeting or what have you, have your comfort breaks, all of that. It felt very back to back. It was just a lot in terms of just this download, and then you're in your home. So you don't even get away from it. So I think those conversations are really good. And I know that you've got some organizations, and my team included, whenever we start a meeting, we tend to ask the question, how are you feeling today? And we do a 1 to 10 thing.
Yeah.
And people literally just put up their fingers, you know, and do you want to discuss that? Do you want to unpack that? Some people say no, but then at least I know, okay, Janice is a 4 today, Ron's a 2 today, Rochelle's a 10 today. And it's respecting that space. And also on Teams, and you've got other software, that you can put focus time in.
Yeah.
So because it's synced to your calendar, it puts focus time. So what that does, it puts you on do not disturb. And it's having these conversations so people in your teams know that put your focus time in, and you can literally say, I want 2 hours a day, 3 hours a day, but that's just uninterrupted time for you to have that downtime, to have that space, and also to have conversations. Like me, I'm dyslexic. So if I see a long email, it freaks me out. I like bullet points or pictures, if you can. But so it's almost like, if I see a barrage of emails, I'm more tempted to put it into a folder or to flag it. Will I get to it that day? Probably not. But in my focus time, that's my email time. So then I always say to people, if you want me to respond today, please mark it as important, so I know it's important to look at.
Yeah.
But that's a different working style. I've got colleagues and worked with people who like long emails, like it very detailed, which is absolutely fine. But I think it's, as leaders, as managers, have those conversations in your virtual setting and say, how do people work? What's your preference? And have that middle ground. And in terms of feeling inclusive as well, I've done like a speaking event, and sometimes, you know, you'll say to people, do you know what, we're having a really good time here. I'll give you a 5 minutes break. Everybody come back in 5 minutes. I was speaking, I was listening to a webinar last week or so. A lady who's a facilitator as well said, you know, I used to do that as well. And once this guy actually came up to her and said, I'm loving the session, I'm learning so much, but I actually have a non-visible disability, and there's no way I'll be able to go for a comfort break in 5 minutes and come back. And you don't think of these things. So it's almost like when you've got these breaks, give breaks, because not everybody's going to tell you what they're going through. So being inclusive just doesn't mean just because of the color of your skin or what you can see visibly. It's also about what people are going through mentally, and, you know, what's positive mental health, what's positive energies, how do people work and think, and not everyone will tell you. And of course, it's very difficult for leaders and managers to know that whole scope, but think about it and throw those questions out. And even if you do anonymous surveys, I know people are survey fatigued, but also say to the team, would it be good if we did anonymous surveys for people to be a bit more vocal and see what works? Again, dialogue. I cannot say speak to people, have the conversations and ask the questions. Because if I think that you're saying to me, for example, you're Muslim or you have a religion, I know that you pray 5 times a day. Say, you know, Nichole, what times do you pray so I can put the team meetings around you? If you're pregnant, you know, how are you feeling today? Are you, you know, like my Einstein moments, or as I call them, are in the mornings. As soon as I hit 10:30, don't even put a meeting in for 3 o'clock, because you know, it's just not working for me. But some people are brighter in the afternoons. So when you know that, I'm happy to facilitate in the mornings, because that's where my creativity is. I'm bang, bang, bang. I can get everybody, you know, upbeat. Ask me to do it at 3 o'clock, you will all sleep, because I'm dead. But then you've got other people in the team where that's their Einstein moments at the end of the day. So it's having those conversations, as I keep saying, but also trying to be inclusive on every level. And you can't think of everything, but that's why dialogue is important, because your team can guide you.
Yeah.
So that's yeah.
And I just want to pick out a word that Nichole said, and she said about trust. And one of the things I noticed, especially in the region, the Caribbean region, working from home was just really didn't happen. And if it was probably the boss at the top who'd work at home for a couple of hours. And the biggest challenge that I found leaders had here was developing that level of trust, because they were so used to people being in front of them, or thinking that if that person's there, I can physically see them, they are productive. And we all know we're all playing Candy Crush, you know, we're all doing something different, you know, whatever the latest game is. So they've really had to adjust their mindset to what does trust look like in this new world. How do I stop bombarding them in meetings or check-in? I mean, I think I saw a couple of company reports not so long ago, where they had I think it was an Indian company who made his team check in on an inordinate amount of time, and he actually bugged their laptops to make sure, or the software he had to make sure they were working. You know, that is intrusive. You have to develop that level of trust even more than so now, because like Nichole said, I don't know for anybody else, but I've been far more productive now, and I worked from home. So before this kicked off, I have been inundated, and having to be able to switch off has been paramount for me. So I totally agree what Nichole said.
Yeah, and trust it, and trust, like you say, because for me now it's almost like it's micromanaging. If you're saying that people should be in the office, I'm micromanaging. I mean, there's a saying that says if you treat your employees like they can change, make a change, they will.
Yeah.
You know, they will make that change when they feel trusted and that they can do that. So you're absolutely right. Trust is just vital and important, and it's difficult because that was the new way. But now it can be done, and it is being done, and it's being more productive because in my commuting time, that's my time to meditate or maybe go for a walk or maybe have breakfast as opposed to trying to take the London rush hour, you know? So, you know, it's about the conversations. But sorry, Ron, I suspect you were going to say something.
Oh, no, I was just going to pick up on a couple of things that you said, but two in particular. One is that this may not seem obvious to some people, but entrepreneurs, business owners tend to hire based on a business culture that they're working towards. And a lot of times this business culture has been in person. What COVID did is I kind of took the carpet and yanked it from under everyone's feet. And this transition isn't going about slowly. This was a very, very, very quick transition. And some of the things that entrepreneurs and business owners and executives hired for the culture they're working towards may not be so great in a remote setting, right? I do think we have to be empathetic towards that for a couple of reasons. I know, Nichole, you talked about, you know, people maybe being in an abusive environment, even have a desk at home. I know when it comes to disabilities, not every disability is visible. Some people do have a very, I know people like that, or look at them, they look fine, but they have, you know, challenges to deal with. But in terms of yanking out that carpet, so I work in a very creative environment, and there are some people who, you know, they're big iMac screens, and they're working on the font, the colors, and everything. And what works for them is being in close proximity to other people, because people can look at their screen and say, "Hey, I like what you're doing there. How about you try this font instead of that?" And it's easy to communicate and collaborate. Not so much when you're working remotely, you know what I mean? And you have to understand that there are some things that may have been very productive, or certain things that add on to a synergy in a face-to-face office simply aren't there. So I think that, you know, you have to be empathetic towards the changes that have come very, very, very quickly with COVID. And we also, after in a post-COVID world, which I hope we're going to get to soon, we're going to have to figure out, well, do we stick with what we have now, what we've been doing for the last 6 months? Do we go back to it, to the old pre-COVID world, or do we have some sort of hybrid? I was talking to a colleague of mine just today, and she was saying, "Hey, I miss the interaction that we used to have, you know, pre-COVID." I asked her, "Well, what would you suggest?" And she actually suggested a hybrid. Some days you come into the office for that community feeling, for that vibe, and other days, you know, you're off. You know, so
yeah.
Now that we've gotten accustomed to a transition that was brought on by a pandemic, when that pandemic ends, we're going to have another transition where there are some people who are going to want to go back to exactly the way it was pre-COVID. Other people will not want to go back to a pre-COVID world. And the other people will want a sort of hybrid. So another transition is coming that we have to prepare for. How do you tell an employee that you allow to work for 6 months at home with no supervision whatsoever, when COVID ends, and say, "I'm sorry, I need to see you in the office to make sure you're doing work"? And that team member is going to say, "Well, what the heck do you think I was doing for the past 6 months? I've been working." You know, so another transition is coming. I think we need to prepare for that transition. That is already on its way.
Yeah, I think that's a really relevant point. And I know this whole season of this whole pandemic, it's really challenged a lot of people mentally. You're right, a real shift is occurring, and it's really highlighting the importance of mental health and the importance of organizational leaders to address and actually try their best to secure and protect the mental health of employees. So I think on one hand, you have that issue of mental health being really highlighted as we really take on board the impact of not just adjusting to the current situation, but also readjusting. Those persons who experience severe anxiety to actually having to return to the office. You're right, that shift has actually occurred. The other thing as well is, to me, it's really promoted the need to also develop our leaders to be more adaptable, to be more flexible, but also our leaders need support. So in addition to supporting the organizations, this sort of transition that we're talking about, our leaders are also struggling with their own personal mental health, their ability to manage and survive effectively.
I think that is a piece for me that's been often missed out. The leaders, because I work with senior leaders and executives and stuff like that, and there's an expectation that you're the leader, so you must know what to do, but it's new for them too. They're traversing it, they're navigating, they still probably got working, children's homeschooling and stuff like that. So there is that understanding, allowing them to switch off, and actually for them, allowing them, going back to what Ron said about knowing that they're allowed to fail. They're not going to get it right every single time. My goal here is for you or your other leader, you above that, is what have you learned and how do we stop that happening next time? How can we improve on it? And that is a whole cultural shift again, in the fact that, especially from a Caribbean perspective, when I think about it's always been about success, success, success. When you look at children at school and how you're passing exams and stuff like that, to say that, you're allowed to fail, but I want you to learn from that failure is a whole different nuance. And for a leader to say it's okay to fail.
And I think that's where you go back to talking about being authentic, because we forget that people are people, and that includes our leaders, that includes the CEOs, that includes the senior managers. And what our organisation does is that we've had more staff briefings, probably a bit more frequent than we would normally have. And we use the Slido app for people to remain anonymous if they want to, and can ask those questions. And each, because we've got different departments and a director that's for each directorate, and they tend to have Q&As for just people in, everyone that they have in those departments. And that's been happening quite often. So if people are worried about redundancies or furlough or just well-being, remote working, anything, those questions are asked openly and honestly, and then you're kind of told beforehand, this is the date we're going to have this. If you have any questions you want to put in beforehand, we'll discuss it. But I think having those open platforms, because we can't go into an office anymore and talk about it, so you're trying to recreate that. But it's okay for senior leaders or managers to say, do you know what, I actually don't know the answer to that. Or sometimes it's nice because some of them will say, do you know what, the kids are out and it's just or they'll be talking and you just hear, Mom, where's the Weetabix? You're like, hold on, babe. But it's human. My son's cat attacked me in the middle of a team meeting. I don't do animals, I'm just letting you know. And this cat came in like a ninja. Like he was just on me and I just was screaming. But the thing is like, it's the new, beforehand you'll be saying to the kids, be quiet. I'm in a meeting where it's now, hold on a second, let me just, so it's become more human, and then you feel you can be authentic. So you don't have to have this success. I can't fail. I can't say I don't know. But you can, because the world is going through this, right?
I want to jump on to something that Janice said, because I think it's very, very important. We were talking about empathy. A lot of times we're talking about leaders having empathy towards team members and employees. Leaders need empathy themselves, right? There is a much higher incidence of mental illness with people. I read an article of entrepreneurs tend to have a certain type of mental illness, musicians, etc. And a lot of times we're looking for our leaders to support us, but sometimes we support our leaders. In the last 24 hours, I actually have 2 team members reach out to me, one by WhatsApp and one by a phone call. I'm thinking, what's wrong? They're like, no, I'm just calling to check up on you to make sure you're okay. I was like, thanks, I guess, we had a great conversation and I appreciated it. You know what I mean? It is very, very difficult for business owners, especially entrepreneurs, who tend to be a little bit more emotionally connected to their business if they build it from the ground up. And going through, we can tell stories all we like about tightening our shoelaces and wearing the beer, but when you're actually in it, your heart rate is pumping. You know, you're wondering, you know, where are we going to get the money to pay rent or staff, where the case is? You know what I mean? So our leaders need empathy, our leaders need support, need to be understanding of the tremendous difficulties and challenges they're going to be facing from a financial perspective, from a legal perspective, from an HR perspective, from a marketing perspective. It's a lot, you know what I mean? So I just wanted to point that out while we were on the topic of empathy and being authentic, that, you know, to give a thought to the people who are perhaps your fellow managers or perhaps are level above you, to understand they're going through a lot as well.
We're all a team, aren't we?
Yeah, and that comes full circle though, doesn't it? Because you said authentic, because once your authenticity shows through and you're leading, not as I want to say from the heart, but you're leading authentically, then people can relate to that and they can see when you're off your game. They can see when maybe you need more support, you know? So if you're still trying to be up there 24/7, you know, and look at me, I'm the big woman, he, man, or whatever, you know, I'm invincible, they're not going to see it. They're going to think, well, he's doing okay. And they always say, look out for that strong friend. You know, look out for the strong leader. Trust me.
And that's what they say. They say, you know, when you see a strong man or a strong woman or a strong leader, they went through a lot to get there. They, you know, you're not born with that level of strength. This means you've probably had the failures, you've had the heartaches. And there's no harm in saying, how are you doing? How can we help? You know, as a team, what do you need us to do? What's your vision? You know, what are you struggling with anything? Is there anything we can take? And as managers and senior leaders, you don't want to have to say to your team, oh no, I'm struggling, but we're a team. That's the thing. And as you, one of you said beforehand, if your team is failing, you look at the leader. So as a team, if you're having any hiccups or anything that's wrong, then support the leader, who will then support you back. So that's a really, really valid point that you made there, Ron. And I think lots of people forget it.
And again, it comes full circle again to trust.
Yes,
it comes back to trust, and it's a two-way trust. You know, it's two-way. So it always comes back to trust and authenticity. And I think once you kind of crack some of those initial things, you're on to a winner.
And it's culture, isn't it? You know, it's cultural change. I'm not talking about culture as in heritage. I'm talking about business culture.
Yes.
And lots of people, they model themselves. And I think it goes even back to what you were saying about branding, Ron. You know, it always reminds me of Cool Runnings. When you think of the Jamaican team was always trying to be like the German team, and they were saying Heinz, zwei, dry, and it just wasn't working out for them. It just wasn't working out. And you know, you look at what you interpret success to be, but everyone's got their own journey, and you can take bits out of that works for you, but you cannot imitate what somebody else is doing or done. So it's for you to be authentic, but to continue learning.
You all make some really valid points. We have just under a minute left.
Wow, really?
Yeah, I mean, when you're having a good conversation, the time just really flies by. But I really appreciate a lot of what you guys have contributed, because you're dead right. And I think that's an issue, especially looking around the support for leaders. That's an issue that's not often flagged during this time. We keep talking about support for employees, but the employee support won't be as strong without the leadership support. So I think that's pretty important. And one of the things I wanted to say as well is it really calls for us to go back to the drawing board from the very beginning. Like I'm talking now at school level and what we're teaching kids and how we're teaching our graduates and so forth. Because we could all remember during our time the ideas of professionalism that we learned. Don't bring yourself to work. Don't bring your problems to work.
Yeah.
You know? In school, we really thought at a very young age to think critically and to be very adaptive and so forth. So it's really calling not just for a mindset shift in the organizational level, but we really have to go right back to the beginning and think about what we're teaching our kids and how we're preparing them for the new future and the new world of work. So it's very interesting times, very interesting times.
Yeah, it is. And just quickly, that is something that you talk about in coaching when you talk about systemic values and values that have been passed on from, say, your parents, your teachers, but then you become the whole person and you realize, well, that's not actually my values, but you think that you're going against the grain because this is what you've been taught. So, for example, you should go to uni, you must go to uni, you should be a doctor. There's many people that you will hear that will say, I didn't want to, this wasn't my chosen career, but my grandmother said I should do it. My dad said, and I hear that often, and I'm even one of those people that I didn't particularly want to do the degree that I did. So, but my mum said I should. So it goes back to what you were saying, is what are we actually feeding the youth, and how are we making them be their authentic selves from a very young age?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you guys so much. Thank you. This has been a rich, rich episode. A lot of food for thought. I overuse that phrase, food for thought, but you always I just left so stimulated at the end of these episodes. We've now concluded our final session of season 1, and this is amazing. We've made it this far, and
Awesome.
thank you guys. Thank you guys for
Well
being
done.
a part of our finale, our season finale.
But before you wrap up, I just want to say on behalf of the panel, thank you, Rochelle, for doing what you're doing with this. Remotely speaking up is, a fantastic venture. You are adding to the conversation, not just adding to the conversation in terms of remote working, but you are leading the conversation. And I know that this is a huge investment of time and energy for you. On behalf of everyone you've interviewed, on behalf of anyone who's going to listen to this or watching this, just want to say thank you very much and keep on doing the fantastic job you're doing.
He's gonna
Agree.
Thanks, Ron. Thank you, Ron.
Well said, well said.
Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate you guys giving your time. So
Thank you.
for our audience, as I'd like to just say my thank you now for everyone who's listened, for all of you guys who've given me your time and your expertise, and just being a part of this venture and being a part of our first season. This, as Ron would tell you, because I know Ron from years now, Ron would tell you, I'm an introvert. So to actually show up online, it was someone really shoving me out the window to actually get into it. But I really appreciate everyone who has listened, everyone who has watched our video series. And yeah, this is the finale of our season 1. And we're looking forward to coming back after a Christmas break for season 2. We're gonna come back with new, fresh topics and new areas to discuss and really take it from different angles and have more guests on. So thank you guys for being a part of this. Thank you to our listeners and for everyone who showed up online. And we just want to say this has been Remotely Speaking Up. Take care. Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.